The studio lights burned with manufactured clarity, painting the set in polished tones of blue and gray. CNN's primetime machine was in full swing. The cameras locked in, the crew efficient and nearly invisible. Anderson Cooper sat poised behind the sleek modern desk, serious, focused, expertly guiding the conversation. Across from him, Jonathan Roumie adjusted his mic. No teleprompter, no talking points, just his voice in exactly 1 minute to use it. The invitation had come suddenly, a rare gesture from Cooper's team, offering Roumie a brief segment to respond to recent comments he'd made about the power of authentic storytelling and the interpretation of public figures' messages in the media. But Jonathan knew what it really was: a setup. 1 minute to speak, 1 minute to be interrupted, framed, and walked over, unless he flipped the script. Backstage, the tension had been thick. Producers paced in headsets. A junior staffer whispered, "He's going to get crushed," as if Jonathan couldn't hear. Maybe he was supposed to hear, but he said nothing. He wasn't here for them. He wasn't even here for Anderson. He was here for the millions watching at home. Those who sought deeper meaning, who felt the stories around them were hollow or incomplete. Jonathan wasn't waiting anymore. As the red light blinked on, signaling they were live, Anderson's voice cut through the room. "We're joined now by Jonathan Roumie, acclaimed actor and public figure. Jonathan, you have 1 minute, 1 minute only. Make it count." The challenge was wrapped in professionalism. Anderson's gaze was direct, expectant. The countdown clock ticked silently in the corner of the screen. Jonathan took a measured breath, his posture radiating a quiet authority gained from countless hours on set and stage. His hand, still resting on the desk, tapped once, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't a nervous tick. It was a beat, the tempo of a message he had waited months to deliver. He leaned forward. "Thank you, Anderson. You're right. I have 60 seconds, so let me use them better than most use 60 minutes. The temperature in the room shifted. Even Anderson's composed expression tightened slightly. This wasn't going to be a soundbite. This was going to be a storm. Jonathan didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His tone was resonant, imbued with a conviction that transcended mere rhetoric. It was the voice of a man accustomed to embodying profound truths, and it didn't ask to be heard. It commanded attention. "The reason people like me get 60 seconds, Anderson, is because people like you get 60 minutes to decide who gets to speak and what counts as truth." The control room tensed. Even the crew, trained to stay stoic through on-air debates, exchanged glances. Anderson, to his credit, maintained his professional demeanor, but a subtle clenching of his jaw betrayed his surprise. Jonathan pressed forward. "For too long, you've stood behind the banner of journalism while deciding which stories to elevate and which to diminish, which perspectives to amplify and which to silence. You've called that discernment. I call it narrative curation." Viewers across the country leaned in. Phones were lifted, screens recorded on social media. Hashtags bearing Jonathan's name began trending within seconds. But he wasn't watching trends. He was watching Anderson. "You say I'm idealistic, that my perspective is perhaps naive. But what exactly is radical about seeking authenticity, about valuing depth over superficiality, about wanting stories that uplift rather than merely divide? Not distorted, not sensationalized, just truly told." Anderson attempted to interject, but Jonathan anticipated it. He raised his hand, a gesture of quiet authority, not to silence, but to steady the moment. It wasn't aggressive, it was surgical. "You told me I had 1 minute. I'm still talking." That line hit like a hammer. Anderson settled back in his seat, his planned interjection derailed, and Jonathan continued unshaken. "The truth is, 60 seconds is all I ever needed because the truth doesn't require filler. It doesn't need spin. It doesn't need a panel or a script. It needs a spine." By now, the control room wasn't just watching, they were listening. "I won't apologize for being direct. I won't ask for more time because I came prepared to say what matters in the time I was given, and I've done exactly that." The countdown clock hit 0, but the silence that followed echoed louder than any word spoken. Anderson stared at him for a moment, a rare flash of speechlessness crossing his face, just long enough for everyone watching to feel the shift. Jonathan nodded once, a quiet signal that his time was done, but the conversation had just begun. The moment the segment cut to commercial, the studio erupted in quiet chaos. Producers scrambled to mute mics. Assistants whispered into earpieces, and Anderson Cooper leaned back in his chair, a subtle furrow in his brow as if replaying the last minute. Jonathan sat still, composed, not triumphant, just steady. A voice in Anderson's earpiece muttered, "We're trending in real time, someone call legal." Another added, "Clips already hit Twitter. The clip's viral. He just burned the script." Anderson turned toward Jonathan, his usual composed smile struggling to assert itself. This time it faltered. "That was, well, certainly concise," Jonathan replied calmly. "I said what I came to say." What struck the room most wasn't the content, though it was razor sharp. It was the control. Jonathan hadn't shouted, he hadn't gotten emotional, he hadn't needed to. His restraint was a weapon. In the hallway outside, an intern stopped scrolling and whispered, "He just did more in 60 seconds than some do in an hour." Across the country, advocates for deeper discourse lit up in praise. Skeptical critics rushed to dismiss it as performance, to frame the moment as calculated theatrics. But regardless of perspective, one truth settled like dust on the studio floor. Jonathan had shifted something. Somewhere in New York, media analysts for multiple outlets began passing the clip around. Journalists texted editors, opinion writers prepped their takes. And back in the makeup room, a makeup artist said quietly to no one in particular, "This won't be the last time we see him here, but next time, they'll want more than a minute." Anderson returned to the air with the next segment, his voice steady, but his tempo slightly off. "Well, that was a lively exchange. Let's move on." But viewers didn't move on. They rewound, they shared, they debated. And Jonathan, he walked out of the building the same way he walked in, focused, unfazed, and carrying nothing but the confidence of someone who knew that sometimes the shortest moments make the loudest echoes. By the time Jonathan stepped out onto the street, his name was already the top trending topic on X, formerly Twitter. Not because he shouted, not because he attacked, but because he reversed the dynamic in a place where the rules were rigged. The sidewalk outside CNN's Manhattan studio was quieter than usual until it wasn't. A group of young people, some clearly fans of his work, others simply captivated by the moment, rushed toward him, phones out, eyes wide. "You shook that whole room," one of them said breathlessly. "I've never seen him look so caught off guard." Jonathan didn't break stride. He smiled politely but kept walking. He wasn't there for a viral moment. He was there for a truth, and the truth had landed. Back inside, Anderson Cooper's team was working damage control. Producers argued over how to reframe the moment in post-show analysis. Some wanted to spin it as reckless. Others said the network should just ignore it. But ignoring it wasn't an option. Clips of the segment were already being dissected by independent analysts, podcasters, and influencers across platforms. Some tried to downplay his presence. It was only 60 seconds, but others weren't so dismissive. He used their platform against them. One popular commentator said they gave him a box and he lit it on fire. Meanwhile, legacy outlets debated whether to even cover it. The New York Times had reporters drafting 3 different headlines, one cautious, one critical, and one that just said, "Jonathan Roumie's 1 minute shook the room." Even critics had to admit he'd said more with less. No teleprompter, no pre-written zingers, no meltdown, just precision. But Jonathan wasn't celebrating. That wasn't his style. He was already reviewing the transcript, analyzing his pacing, his timing, his tone, not for ego, for purpose, because he knew something bigger was coming. And elsewhere, behind closed doors, cultural commentators and media strategists were making notes. Some saw him as a threat, others saw him as a blueprint. But everyone agreed on one thing. Jonathan Roumie had just rewritten the rules of live television. That night, Jonathan didn't go to a celebration dinner. He didn't book a victory appearance on a popular talk show. Instead, he walked into his small apartment, loosened his tie, and sat at his kitchen table in silence. The glow of his laptop screen reflected in his eyes as he scrolled through thousands of mentions, comments, and tags. Praise, outrage, edits of his 60 seconds turned into TikToks, reels, GIFs, even remixes. But Jonathan wasn't smiling. He was discerning. His mentor had once told him, "When you get the mic, never waste it, but don't worship it either." And tonight proved that he hadn't wasted it. But now came the harder part: follow through. Across the country, college students debated his words in late-night dorm conversations. Families sat around dinner tables arguing over whether he was a voice of needed introspection or another calculated showman. Even late-night comedians couldn't ignore him. They mocked the moment but unintentionally amplified it. Jonathan noted each response, every angle, every attempt to twist, defend, or dilute. He wasn't afraid of being misunderstood. He was prepared for it. Meanwhile, Anderson Cooper released a carefully worded tweet. Always welcome thoughtful disagreement on this show. Last night's exchange was sharp. We stand by respectful discourse. Respectful maybe, but everyone knew the segment had slipped out of Anderson's control. And it wasn't disrespectful, it was disruptive. And that disruption rippled through places Jonathan had targeted from the beginning. Mainstream media silos, superficial echo chambers, and complacent gatekeepers of public narratives. The next morning, he woke to a flood of new interview requests from both sides. Other networks wanted to dig deeper. Talk shows wanted a full segment. Joe Rogan's team sent a message saying, if you're not afraid of long form, we've got 3 hours ready. But Jonathan didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, he opened his notebook and flipped to a page he'd labeled months ago. Phase 2. 1 minute had opened the door, but what came next would blow it off the hinges. 3 days had passed. Not a word from Jonathan. No tweets, no interviews, no commentary. The media didn't know what to do with that. Cable news networks expected him to make a tour of victory laps. Instead, he disappeared from public view, which only added fuel to the fire. Commentators speculated, was he afraid? Was he being silenced? Was the industry already putting pressure on him? The truth was much simpler and far more dangerous to his critics. He was preparing. Inside a nondescript brownstone office on the outskirts of DC, Jonathan sat across from a whiteboard filled with arrows, headlines, and dates. His small but loyal team surrounded him. Digital strategists, legal advisors, and 2 seasoned advisors who understood the cost of challenging established narratives. We're not here to talk louder, he said firmly. We're here to talk smarter. His appearance on Cooper hadn't been a one-off. It had been the spark, and now the kindling was ready to catch. But this next move had to be deliberate, calculated, ruthless in its clarity. He tapped the marker against a bullet point at the center of the board. Narrative collapse. His team leaned in. The media expects a reaction. What we're going to give them is a plan. He laid it out. A campaign of speaking engagements at universities that would never host him under normal circumstances. Yale, Berkeley, NYU. Not to win them over, but to expose the cracks in the intellectual and cultural landscape from the inside. Next, a podcast. Not reactionary, but foundational. Long-form, thoughtful, and unfiltered. Where others ranted, he would reconstruct. Where others flamed out, he would frame the next generation's core language of meaning and purpose. They gave me 60 seconds. Now I'm taking 60 cities. It wasn't bravado, it was blueprint. Outside the building, a photographer tried to snap pictures through a tinted window. Inside, Jonathan flipped to a fresh page in his journal. He wrote 3 words. They blinked first. The first speaking engagement was at Yale. It wasn't a coincidence. It was strategic. One of the country's most prestigious and ideologically insular institutions. The kind of place where dissent wasn't silenced with force, but with smugness, passive ridicule, and strategic apathy. The student government tried to cancel him days before. Petitions circulated, professors tweeted statements of concern. The campus newspaper ran an op-ed titled, "Jonathan Roumie doesn't belong here." Jonathan read it, then printed it out and placed it in his leather folder right beside his notes. The auditorium was packed. Protesters chanted outside, holding signs that read, "No platform for dogmatists," and "Silence is safer." But the room inside was silent, expectant. Jonathan walked onto the stage with his usual calm, yet commanding presence. No security detail, no flashy entourage, just him and a slim microphone clipped to his lapel. He didn't start with greetings. "Before I begin," he said, unfolding the newspaper clipping, "I want to thank the student columnist who wrote this. It reminded me that your fear is never about what I say. It's about what might happen if people listen." Gasps. He held the silence, let it thicken. "I didn't come here to be liked. I came here because your leaders claim to care about inclusion until someone like me walks in." He spoke for 30 minutes. No teleprompter, just fact, principle, challenge. His words weren't aimed at changing minds in the room. They were aimed at exposing the intellectual cowardice outside it. He spoke of free inquiry, not as an entitlement, but as a sacred duty. He referenced figures like Viktor Frankl and C.S. Lewis, drawing on timeless wisdom and contemporary challenges, not to preach, but to illuminate universal human struggles. "Your institutions," he said, "have become allergic to discomfort. And the moment discomfort walks in, you call it violence. That's not scholarship. That's fragility." A student stood and shouted, "You're a demagogue!" From the back of the room, without missing a beat, Jonathan turned toward the voice. "And yet here I am letting you speak freely while you try to shut me down. Think carefully about who's behaving like what." The audience shifted. Some clapped, some stood, but everyone remembered. By morning, clips from Jonathan's speech had flooded every social platform. But it wasn't just what he said, it was how the room responded. Half of the crowd stood in ovation. The other half sat in stunned silence, not sure whether they had witnessed a takedown or a reawakening. Either way, it wasn't forgettable. One video in particular went viral. It showed the exact moment Jonathan responded to the heckler in the crowd. His delivery was cold steel, measured, unflinching. The caption read, "When the student lost control, he gained it all." Mainstream media struggled to spin it. CNN tried to downplay it. Other networks labeled it performative. But alternative media and thoughtful discussion platforms seized the moment and ran it on a loop. Fox News aired a special titled 60 Seconds Wasn't a Fluke, Jonathan Roumie's Yale Moment. Even Joe Rogan weighed in. "I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. That man walked into the lion's den and made them look like kittens." Late that evening, the Yale administration issued a carefully crafted statement emphasizing their commitment to free expression in safe environments. But students weren't buying it. Outside the administration building, hundreds of students gathered, not in protest, but in conversation. Groups who had never spoken to one another, libertarians, moderates, even quiet leftists, tired of the censorship culture, discussed Jonathan's message. He had done more than challenge narratives. He had made people talk to each other again. Meanwhile, inside his modest DC apartment, Jonathan sat on the edge of his bed, reading private messages from students. "I didn't agree with everything, but you made me think in a way I haven't in years. Thank you for showing up. No one ever does. You were the only one with the guts to come here and not flinch." He didn't reply. Not yet. He simply bookmarked them, and then he pulled out his folder again, this time placing a copy of the Yale op-ed next to his next stop, Columbia. The title on his notepad read, "The Next Fault Line." Because Yale was never the peak, it was just the first crack. Columbia University wasn't just another stop. It was the stronghold, the place where established orthodoxy had gone from intellectual theory to institutional gospel. Jonathan knew the moment he stepped foot on that campus, it wouldn't be about discourse. It would be about dominance. The flyers advertising his appearance were torn down within hours. Student groups issued joint statements condemning his presence. A professor tweeted, "We don't tolerate dogmatism in the name of free expression." The irony wasn't lost on him. Inside the auditorium, tension buzzed like electricity in the air. Protesters lined the walls. Faculty sat in the back, arms crossed. Security had been doubled. A few in the audience wore masks, not for health, but for anonymity. When Jonathan took the stage, the noise outside swelled. Chants, drums, slogans. But the moment he began speaking, it all faded beneath his resonant voice. "I wasn't invited here to tell you what you want to hear," he began. "I came because you've been told your entire lives that truth is subjective and feelings are facts. That ends now." Gasps, whispers, but no one walked out. Not yet. He walked them through a history of intellectual and spiritual suppression disguised as safety. He cited historical movements, philosophical insights, moments where authenticity had cost everything and where conformity had cost more. Then he paused, stepped forward, and looked directly at the front row. "The real danger on this campus isn't what I say in the next 30 minutes. It's the fact that most of you have never heard someone like me speak in your entire academic career. That's not diversity, that's control." A student tried to interrupt, shouting about privilege, about oppression, about trauma. Jonathan waited, let him finish, then responded, not with anger, but with something far sharper: clarity. If the only way you can preserve your ideas is by shielding them from challenge, maybe they're not ideas worth defending. The room shifted. Some students turned toward him, suddenly still, others toward each other, confused. The wall was cracking. He closed his speech with a quote from Václav Havel. "The truth is not something that can be invented or suppressed by any power. The truth is a living thing." And then for just a moment, there was silence. Then applause. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't even majority, but it was real from students who had never clapped for someone like him in their lives. That night, Columbia didn't just host a debate, it hosted a fracture. The tour wasn't supposed to work. That was the consensus in every media newsroom, academic think tank, and cultural war room in New York. Give a prominent actor 60 seconds. Maybe he rattles some cages, but then he fades out. Jonathan didn't fade. He multiplied. After Columbia, he received invitations from students, not administrations, to speak at Penn, Duke, Michigan, Stanford. And he accepted everyone, not because he needed their platforms, but because he wanted to turn their walls into windows. What began as a viral clip had morphed into a cultural rupture. Each stop wasn't just a speech, it was a confrontation, not between left and right, but between comfort and confrontation, between narrative and fact, between fear and freedom. Major outlets tried to ignore his rise, but underground videos of his talks reached tens of millions. On TikTok, Gen Z creators stitched his responses into commentary. On YouTube, his Columbia lecture was translated into 5 languages. Across various communities, he became a symbol of authentic expression. Across others, he became a challenging presence. But what made him unstoppable wasn't just what he said. It was that he never blinked. He didn't try to pander. He didn't apologize for being who he was. He didn't dilute his values to fit into rooms where he wasn't welcome. He simply showed up well-researched, articulate, calm, powerful in precision, and let the room deal with the consequences. And it all started with 60 seconds. The next time Anderson Cooper spoke about him reluctantly on air, he referred to Jonathan as a uniquely compelling voice in the public discourse. It wasn't praise, but it was respect, and it was admission. Jonathan sat in a small studio in Virginia when he heard it. He smiled. "That's all I ever needed," he said to his team. 60 seconds and an open mic. The rest was just gravity. Behind him, a wall of headlines grew larger by the day. Jonathan Roumie moved Stanford crowd, the Yale speech that ignited a conversation. He was supposed to lose the room. He stirred the country instead, and at the bottom, taped in the center, still preserved from that very first day, just 60 seconds. They said 60 seconds wasn't enough. They said he didn't belong on their stages. They said his voice was too earnest, too challenging, too unyielding, but the truth doesn't ask for permission, and courage doesn't wait for applause. Jonathan Roumie didn't need a platform. He became one. He didn't follow the script. They tried to diminish him. So he crafted his own message. From Yale to Columbia, from viral clips to national headlines, he didn't just speak. He compelled the room to listen. Because when you give someone like him 60 seconds, you don't just start a conversation, you spark a reawakening.